In the United Kingdom and the United States, some religious leaders, intellectuals, and artists took a stand against the horrors of the exploitation and social status of Africans and other indigenous people. On the European mainland, in France and Germany, the antecedents of modern-day socialist thought had its theoretical origins. During the 18th century, revolutionary ideas arose in France in response to the feudal system. There were socialists involved in the French Revolution of 1789. In the aftermath of the events of 1789, there was a gradual transition from what was known as radical enlightenment as a political philosophy to socialism. This took place in France. In France, one of the revolutionary leaders, Babiev, felt that the aims and principles of the upheaval of 1789 had been betrayed. Therefore, in 1796, he led an attempt to seize power in order to implement their conception of Rousseau's social contract theory. This group was known as the Conspiracy of Equals and were eventually brought to trial in France. The Conspiracy of Equals is considered by many to be the first organization that attempted to seize power who were motivated by socialist ideals. Later, during the 1830s and 40s, there was a strong emergence of socialist thought in France. This was the result of the rise of an industrially based middle class which accumulated wealth at unprecedented levels. These economic developments in France, as well as England, exacerbated class differences and created greater impoverishment of the masses. In England, the rapid industrialization fueled by the profitability of the Atlantic slave trade prompted the English Chartist movement that sought to extend the franchise to working people. During this period, people like Robert Owen, a British socialist, sought the establishment of utopian communities, such as the New Lanark settlement. However, even though these forms of socialism understood the unjust character of the capitalist system, it did not rely on the working class as an engine of revolutionary change by seizing power from the burgeoning bourgeoisie in Europe.
That's right.
Now, the developments leading up to the 1848 uprisings in France and other European countries saw the emergence of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels as the major theoreticians and tacticians of socialism. Marx, in writings after 1844, placed the working class at the center of his analysis of the necessity of not only analyzing the problems created by capitalist industrialization, but to develop a strategy and program for the overthrow of the oppressive system. Even though the attempts of revolutions in 1848 failed in Europe, there were tremendous lessons learned from this period. Marx and Engels understood that it would be many more years for the class consciousness and experience of working people to mature to the degree that the seizure of power by the proletariat would be possible. In a message to the Communist League in 1850, Marx puts forward a program of struggle for the organization that would distinguish it politically from the bourgeois democrats of the period. In the 1870 and 1871 period, a working class uprising developed in France and culminated in what was known as the Paris Commune. These events raised the hopes of the workers seeking to break with the rule of the bourgeoisie. Marx's essay, The Civil War in France, analyzes the outcome of the Paris Commune as a great advancement in working class organization, but it could not, under the then existing circumstances, maintain its influence and effectively shape the future of the political course of France. Engels, in his essay entitled Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, traces the origin of socialism in Europe to the period of French Enlightenment. However, it would be the expansion and development of the proletariat in Europe that provided the basis for the transformation of socialism from an idealistic worldview to a scientific ideology that can provide a program for the workers to seize power in their own name and in their own interests. There were other developments, revolutionary developments, that came about in Europe. There was bourgeois democracy, which was an advancement over feudalism. Other movements grew up in Europe which competed with socialism. For example, the anarchists under Michael Bakunin, who disagreed with Marx and Engels over the character of the state and its role after the revolution. Anarchism has an industrial form, and syndicalism, which took root in several European countries as well. These disagreements in Europe hampered the growth of the First International, founded by Karl Marx in 1864 in London. And just to touch on the African tradition, in Africa we had communalism prior to the development of feudalism and other forms of class society. And Kwame Nkrumah mentioned in his book Class Struggle in Africa, which was published in 1970, he says that in general, at the opening of the colonial period, the peoples of Africa were passing through the higher stage of communalism, characterized by the disintegration of tribal democracy and the emergence of feudal relationships, hereditary, tribal chieftaincies, and monarchical systems like you had in Ethiopia. You had them in Songhai, Monomotapa, the Zulu kingdoms, Egypt, Nubia, and the Kingdom of Congo. With the impact of imperialism and colonialism, communalistic socioeconomic patterns began to collapse as a result of the introduction of export crops such as cocoa and coffee. So it was the advent of European slavery and colonialism that destroyed the traditional communal systems in Africa. People need to recognize this. And Nkrumah continues by pointing out that, quote, the economies of the colonies became interconnected with the world capitalist markets. Capitalism, individualism, and tendencies to private ownership grew, even in Africa. Gradually, primitive communalism disintegrated and the collective spirit declined. There was an expansion of private farming and the method of small commodity production, and that still exists today in Africa. We still have the problem of capitalism and imperialism, and the current global economic crisis is having a devastating impact on the African continent. Now, in the United States, just very briefly, I wanted to discuss the development of socialist movements in this country. Many of these movements were influenced by utopian socialism that had developed in Europe. We also had some socialist movements that came out of religious traditions, which is quite interesting. For example, the utopian socialists more than likely had their ideological origins in the Christian church, where during the late 18th century, groups such as the Shakers broke away from the established church in England and traveled to the United States. The leader of the Shakers, Mother Ann Lee, advocated the withdrawal of members from the broader society in order to form their own community in preparation for the impending destruction of society and the world. Eventually, the socialist movement became more secular and focused on the concrete needs of working people. However, its political program became more practical and distanced itself from the anarchists and advocates of revolutionary violence and armed struggle to overthrow capitalism. For example, the socialist SDP, the Social Democratic Party, which is one of the early parties that developed in the United States. You had the Socialist Labor Party, the Social Democratic Party. Now, eventually, the SDP, for example, the Social Democrats, did not advocate rebellion and armed struggle as a means of achieving its goal, but they advocated political education. It was headed by a man by the name of Berger. But prior to Berger, there was people such as Daniel de Leon, who was a leader of the Socialist Labor Party. He was of Dutch and Jewish origin. He had been a lecturer at Columbia University. Then Victor L. Berger, who was based in the city of Milwaukee, which became a centerpiece of socialist policies in an urban setting. This was during the beginning of the 20th century. He would be elected to Congress in 1911 for a 2-year term. He would later serve in Congress between 1923 and 1929. Milwaukee also elected a socialist mayor, Emile Sedel, in 1910. Overall, between 1910 and 1912, socialists elected approximately 1,000 of its members to offices across the country and had over 100,000 official members. Now, you don't hear this, we're not taught this in high school history classes, that you had viable socialist parties even here in the United States beginning in the first part of the 20th century.